everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Source, where we interview journalists, whistleblowers, policy experts, and political dissidents. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak. Joining me today is journalist and editor-in-chief of the Watchdog, Tareq Haddad. Tareq, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. So I know that we both worked together while I was in London, and we were covering Julian Assange's extradition hearings, and we were covering that for the Watchdog. We had a podcast, and before you created the Watchdog, you were a journalist with Newsweek. But you have a pretty interesting story here. So how did you go from writing for Newsweek to creating your own independent newswire, the Watchdog, and why?
Sure. I mean, it's obviously can be quite a long story, so I don't try and give you the sort of TLDR version or the briefer version. But so I've kind of been a journalist for a long time, kind of on and off at some occasions because, previously having worked for other publications, I kind of got frustrated with the industry, felt like I couldn't really tell the truth and report, what I was really seeing in kind of world affairs and in foreign affairs. So I actually had a kind of a 2-year period where I stepped away from journalism and tried to do some other things, but kind of got drawn back to it in September. And because I had kind of relationships with people at Newsweek, I got a job there as a reporter, so covering foreign affairs and politics, just as I did kind of previously to that. And then, as many people are probably already aware, we had this incident where documents were published in WikiLeaks, and through the work of other sort of academics and journalists, we had whistleblowers coming out of the OPCW, the UN-backed chemical weapons watchdog. So we had whistleblowers kind of blowing up that narrative apart of the war in Syria, which, many journalists have kind of known from the very beginning. And there's, very good journalists such as Vanessa Beeley or many others that kind of have covered, the war in Syria for a long time. But, once I felt like I was in a position where I couldn't tell the truth about what was happening, I had to resign. And in doing so, I kind of exposed a certain element of the mainstream media and their conflict of interest and why certain stories never get to see the light of day. And that's kind of what inspired me to want to set up the Watchdog. I wanted to set up a news organization that was going to be, better suited to, covering what was really happening and kind of correcting for some of the failures that we see in mainstream media. And as we can sort of see present day, we can all kind of, there's lots of people that dislike the mainstream media at the moment, and we're seeing it right now. They're, very dishonest about, the current situation in many different things. For the average sort of American or British citizen, their understanding of world affairs is very different than what's actually happening in the world. And that's actually, has devastating consequences. And for the first time, we're seeing those devastating consequences worldwide. So it's, we need kind of better journalism now more than ever.
Now, can you explain a little bit more about the Watchdog, what it is, and why you created the organization, and ultimately what your goals are?
Yeah, I mean, so at the moment, it's nothing more than a website, just kind of putting the pieces together. But, I have kind of ambitions of how I want to build it in terms of making it a platform that, journalists can submit stories and, people from all sort of different types of journalism, so photojournalists or video journalists and, straight kind of news journalists. So I want to have a platform where people can submit their stories and, have them fact-checked, edited in a kind of professional way, as you'd sort of expect in sort of an old school kind of journalism type platform. And then kind of combining that with sort of new technology that we know about censorship and all that kind of thing, but I also want to make it a more transparent company than anything we've seen in other previous media, because I think that's probably one of the biggest problems is that every mainstream media organization has dubious links to certain think tanks or they have corporate funding or whatever, and these things have been discussed in alternative media for a long time. So I kind of want to mesh the two between, all the things that alternative media is doing so well at the moment with the kind of shortfalls in mainstream media.
To go back to your time at Newsweek, as I mentioned earlier, you and I covered Assange's extradition hearings, and this was back in February. Now, what was the perspective on Assange and of WikiLeaks within the Newsweek newsroom?
Yeah, it's kind of a strange one to say because I think it obviously depends on person to person, but as a kind of organization as a whole, not that you can sort of, but it didn't. It's kind of one of those situations where you have, in the newsroom, it's not actually what is the kind of facts in the ground. It's because, if you're working in a newsroom day in, day out, you've kind of been hammered with these headlines of, sexual misconduct allegations or, fake rape allegations, as we should say now, as we know that they've been falsified. But people that work in this kind of gated narrative is that they believe these stories. They believe that Julian Assange is some sort of supervillain, that he's kind of this cocky kind of guy that's bad to women. But it's very different than the actual truth that like yourself and me and many others have been aware of for a long time. But yeah, so when I kind of had situations where I was already trying to write certain stories about Julian Assange. I'd been speaking to his lawyers and kind of trying to prepare a piece before kind of all these hearings kicked off. But there was very little interest in covering these things. And it was little signs like that I realized that it's not just about Julian Assange that this happens with. This happens kind of at a systemic level with what happened with Jeffrey Epstein, what happened with me in Syria, what happens in Iraq. There's certain things that you just can't really talk about honestly in mainstream media, if you're kind of being truthful to what's happening.
Do you think that there is an element of self-censorship among mainstream media journalists, or do you think this is more of a systemic issue where it's really coming from maybe the top down?
Yeah, of course. It's I think it's definitely both. I mean, there's outside factors, obviously corporations and so on, that will not have, would not be in their interest to report certain stories. But I think at a certain level, it's self-censorship too, where people are afraid to tell the truth because, they don't want to lose their jobs. In certain cases, they probably might not even be aware that they're scared to tell the truth. They're just kind of so ingrained in their kind of routine jobs that they actually don't realize that most of their reporting is inaccurate. So it's definitely a combination of both. But I wish I could remember the introduction to not 1984 to Animal Farm, which has got a sort of a great essay on self-censorship. But unfortunately, I don't have one of those minds that can just quote it off the top of my head.
So Tareq, why don't we take a short pause right now so we can have a quick break, and when we return we will continue our discussion on independent journalism, and then we will also get into the state of press freedoms around the world. But before that, check out this commercial.
Pure journalism. Every journalist in the world should have been cheering Edward Snowden. He did what every journalist is supposed to be devoted to.
Because we have evidence that when we do that, things go wrong.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak. With me is the Watchdog Editor-in-Chief, Tareq Haddad. Tareq, so we were talking about independent journalism earlier, but I now want to transition to World Press Freedom Day. May 3rd is World Press Freedom Day. It is a day to honor journalists and specifically at-risk journalists, and also a day to remind governments that they should be honoring press freedoms. So this is a very broad question here, but what is your perspective on the state of the press worldwide?
Worldwide, I think it's a very difficult situation, obviously. It doesn't seem to be getting better, but to be quite frank with you, I'm not in a position to comment on kind of what press freedom is like in China or Russia, even though I'm sure it's not great. I've heard from, reputable sources that it's not great. I've always kind of taken the mentality of you can only really affect what's in your kind of country and your sort of sphere of influence. I've always sort of kind of tried to focus my attention more on the UK and the US generally. And that's not from kind of any place of malice. It's just, our countries have a long, history of defending these freedoms. And I think in recent years, we've definitely kind of failed those historical standards, as you might say. So at the moment, in terms of UK and US, the situation is not very good at all. I think according to the latest rankings that were put out by the Reporters Without Borders, I think the United States is now 53rd or something along those lines. I can't remember the specific number, but and anyone objectively can say that the press freedom is not in a good state in the United States, where you have not just journalists being attacked and locked up and threatened with severe sentences. It's whistleblowers, and we can obviously talk about Julian Assange, as we've done for a considerable amount of time, and we should be talking about that. That's of course a case worthy of everyone's attention. But in general, the situation is not good. We have numerous whistleblowers that are getting lengthy prison sentences. I think not enough people know certain names. There's certain names like Reality Winner or Philip Hammond. Certain names that most people on the street have never heard of. But the reasons that they're in prison are for trying to kind of tell the truth about certain situations. And obviously in the UK, we have what's happening with Julian Assange. We can't pretend to be a country that cares about freedom of speech and freedom of expression if a journalist to the kind of caliber of, or publisher to the caliber of what Julian Assange has done, if he is in Belmarsh, then it's not we're not a society that tolerates a free press, clearly. So as long as he's in prison, there's a great injustice happening at the moment.
Absolutely. And I know you did say that you can't really speak to what is happening in other countries, but I do know, at least through my own perspectives, that in the United States, the US is very critical of other countries, specifically China, Russia, Iran, for maybe their press freedom violations. But when it happens here in the US or in Western countries, we're very reluctant to call that out or stand up for Western journalists. Do you have the same perspective? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and it's kind of symbolic of a wider UK-US mindset of where, we expect all these countries to adhere to these expectations that we profess to hold, but we often do a very bad job in doing that ourselves. I mean, if you walk around the Middle East or, Syria or Iraq and make a joke about American democracy and see the reaction that you'll get from locals there, it's a joke to them, the idea of, America is coming there to spread democracy or to spread freedom of expression or certain rights. In their experience of dealing with the UK and the US, that's not what they've had. So yeah, I think there's an obvious massive double standard that we need to address. And it starts with freedom of expression. I think, it's not something that we've had to be overly concerned about in the past. I think, we've historically had very good protections for freedom of expression. It's something that's within our culture, but I think recently it's kind of seems to be dying, and no one even is noticing because we're kind of in a state of free fall at the moment. So many things are going wrong at once. We've got health services that have been underfunded for years, or in the US, you've got a kind of a very expensive medical system where, you're dependent on insurance, and, you've got this whole kind of system that's not working, essentially, students coming out with thousands and thousands in debt, and it's just all these factors coming in at once where, it's kind of, we're living in this moment where it's all kind of seems to be crumbling down, but, it's now more than ever that we need those protections. There's a reason that freedom of the press is the First Amendment, which kind of people forget. It's the most important one, and it's the one that we're failing on most severely at the moment.
As far as the world's kind of crumbling right now, we are definitely living in a time of uncertainty. And I know that you are obviously located in the UK, and the UK is still on a lockdown. It has been extended. So what is life like in a lockdown in the UK right now? And if you feel comfortable sharing your thoughts on the government's reaction to this COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of talk of, we need to trust the scientists and all that kind of thing. But, what happens when those scientists have severe conflict of interest and, what they're telling us isn't, exactly what is the best scientific evidence that's out there. And kind of, we've got this situation where we've got the sort of the people that are leading or that are advising the government on science, have funding from big pharma and, vaccines companies and all that kind of thing. And, the advice of actual scientists and people that look into this stuff and that do so from kind of genuine care for people or genuine care for science getting ignored. They're the ones that are getting censored on YouTube and getting removed off Twitter. And so we kind of have the situation where we're told that we can only trust these official sources. But obviously, these official sources are the ones that got us in this mess in the first place. I'm not sure if you or your readers or listeners will be aware of this recent report, but something that journalists have been saying from the very beginning, or the good ones at least, is that we had good reason to suspect that this COVID-19 came from a US biowarfare lab, or at least an institute where they study kind of these types of viruses, to kind of put it mildly. And we had this report that came out 2 days ago from Diliana. I'm going to murder her last name, so I'm not going to say it. But she's reporting at Arms Watch. And she put out a very excellent report with kind of insider documents, signatures from all sorts of military officials that show that the US government has been, and through the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, have been funding these types of programs where they're studying these viruses from as early as, I think, 2015. Don't quote me on the dates, but I recommend that everyone reads Diliana's reports. But yeah, in terms of the general situation here in the UK, it's all a bit dystopian, as I'm sure it is in many different cities and places across the world. We're all sort of living in this lockdown, which I'm particularly kind of, from my perspective, I don't think it's the way that we should be dealing with this situation. But again, it's kind of, we're in this place where everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. But unfortunately, what I believe might happen is that, because what the mainstream media will be telling people is that, it's never good, that lie that it came from a US biowarfare lab is not going to go away. So it's going to be blaming China, blaming Trump, or blaming whatever. It's going to become this political issue again, but actually, in the meantime, lives of millions of people are going to suffer from, all the consequences of this fallout that we've had from kind of irresponsible government that have kind of tried to play this big game with everyone. I think, I live in a kind of, not the most, not the richest part of London, and so you kind of see it as you're walking around every day. There's more homeless people, there's more people struggling. My area is kind of filled with businesses that would normally be open. They're not the kind of people that can work from home. All those businesses, there's must be hundreds of them, small little shops, kind of DIY shops, plant shops, hairdressers, all these little things run by kind of low working class people. They're just kind of having had to sit at home for multiple months. So I think for a lot of people, they've kind of missed the bigger picture of what's happening. They can work from home and they can jump on a Zoom call and they can have a meeting with, their kind of corporate companies, or they can jump on house party with their friends and watch Netflix and forget about all of this. They still have kind of steady streams of income, but actually a lot of people are going to be hurt by what's happening, and it's going to get worse. It's pretty much a repetition of the 2008 financial crisis, and I think it's going to be much worse, unfortunately.
You're right. It's very concerning as to what this will all look like once the COVID-19 crisis is over. But Tareq, before we do close out here, how can people help you out? You were once, of course, a journalist with Newsweek. You are now independent. So how can people help you, and where can they find your work?
That would be great if they could. Any donations are welcome. And I'm, as I've said before, I want to make this a transparent media company. So part of that is having all of the donations available, and all of my funding and how even the money is spent to be available, so we can have sort of greater transparency. So if I'm not doing a good enough job with the money, people can see that. All the financials are there for people to inspect. But they can go to tareqhaddad.com, which is my personal website, or the watchdog.net, and that's kind of where I'm building the organization. The website might be kind of jumping around or being changed a lot in the next few weeks. I'm kind of hoping to roll out a few different things and start building that platform. But one of those two places you should be able to find somewhere to help. And if you could also leave your email, and then you'll get kind of everything that we publish will come straight to your inbox. And I think now, where we're living in a world with Twitter censorship and YouTube censorship and all that kind of thing, the best way is just to kind of stick your email, and then you'll get all sorts of updates. And even if you're not kind of funding, I think it's just important for people to be reading the kind of stuff that I'm hoping to be putting out, because I think, we all need more truthful media. So.
All right, Tareq Haddad, thank you so much for joining me, and good luck to you.
Appreciate it.
All right, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you are able to, please donate so we can continue with our independent news and analysis. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak, and I will see you all next time.